It is, in my humble opinion, fundamental to combine resistance training at the very least with an energy deficit through nutritional restriction to promote weight loss. And here's why. If you do not lift weights, even if you just do cardio, you will lose muscle as you're losing body fat. Evidence shows 25% to 30% of the weight lost will come from muscles if you don't do resistance training. My views have, in certain respects, done 180, and nothing can be characterized more so than loading. So I had always thought that if you're doing anything over 12 to 15 repetitions, it's basically glorified cardio, and that, it's just muscle endurance. You're not going to gain muscle. The literature is now compellingly shown. There's so much literature on the topic. Our lab has done quite a bit of research, as well as many others. And it shows that you can gain muscle, similar amounts of muscle, regardless of the loading, across a wide range of loading spectrums, up to 30 to even 40 repetitions, which is that's a long set.
Hi everyone, I'm sitting here with Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, who is a professor at Lehman College in the Bronx in New York City. His research primarily focuses on muscle adaptations to strength training, muscle hypertrophy. He has published over 300 studies in the field of exercise, sports nutrition. I am super excited to talk about so many things related to why we should care about resistance training, about the mechanics, training load, training intensity, reps, how many to do, sets, whether we should rest or stretch, or everything related to resistance training and muscle adaptations to resistance training. This is going to be a great podcast. So Brad, thank you so much for coming out. Really excited to learn everything that we're going to talk about today related to muscle hypertrophy and muscle adaptations in response to resistance training. But maybe we can just start with resistance training. I mean, why should people care about resistance training?
So in my humble opinion, certainly every form of exercise, or most forms of exercise, are very beneficial. Doing something is always better than doing nothing for your health. But if I were to pick one activity that is indispensable, it would be resistance training. And there's a couple of reasons. So certainly cardiovascular exercise, it's been much more well researched over the years, and indisputably it has great effects on your health and wellness. But resistance training has many of the same benefits as cardiovascular exercise, but it goes well beyond what you can get through aerobic training, and particularly dealing with muscle strength, obviously, and bone density, and other things like posture. So aerobic exercise itself has very minimal effects on your strength levels, on muscle development, on muscle hypertrophy, even on bone development. So certainly running has certain benefits to bone, but nothing in the way that resistance training does. And again, things like your posture, people don't even consider if you are sedentary and not doing anything, over time you're going to lose muscle, your posture is going to go, and you could do all the aerobic training you want. It's really not going to have these benefits.
So that you just mentioned two things that I was unaware of, in the bone density and the posture. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Resistance training affecting bone density? Because that seems very relevant for particularly post-menopausal women.
It is. So osteoporosis, which is basically porous bones, it's when over time, the aging process, your bones, if you are sedentary in particular, will start to degrade. And the 80% of people with osteoporosis are women, because women generally, number one, start out with less bone mass. And there's also effects of, as you mentioned, estrogen is osteoprotective. So when women undergo menopause, postmenopausally, they're going to have increased bone resorption, which is going to increase their chances of getting osteoporosis. And resistance training, by pulling on the bones, muscle pulling on the bones. So there's an interaction. Your musculoskeletal system is the muscle that allows, when you have movement, it's the muscle pulling on the bones to move. And strength training really is the primary way to strengthen the bones. So while you're strengthening the muscles, necessarily the bones become strengthened as well. And there's certain ways that are going to be more appropriate than others to maximize that process. But really, no matter what type of resistance training you do, whether it's light loads, heavy loads, etc., you're going to be strengthening bones. Whereas, and it's always, by the way, specific to the joint that you're working. So it's weight-bearing exercise in particular is what strengthens bones. If you're doing cycling or even the elliptical machine, it's really not weight-bearing enough to have substantial effects on bone development. And swimming, another endeavor. Whereas running, to some extent, there is ground reaction forces, but it's mostly specific to the femur, to your lower body musculature, whereas the spine and the wrist is going to be a major area for osteoporosis, particularly in women. Anyway, long story short is that resistance training, when done regularly and consistently over time, has profound effects on staving off the potential for osteoporosis and even building bones, particularly when you're younger.
You said there are certain types of exercises that may, be better, or is there any types of exercises that you can talk about?
Yeah, so it seems so. Most of the research has been using somewhat heavy, moderate to heavier loading. I'm not convinced, though. I think it's an effect that we just don't have research that's really looked at doing lighter load training with bone density. And I would surmise if you are training with a good deal of effort, high levels of intensity of effort, that you would achieve similar effects. But it also does seem that doing more multi-joint movements, so multi-joint meaning like squats, movements that are utilizing more than one joint. Multi-joint is more than one joint. So rather than a curl, you can get better effects overall on bone because of the loading that is imposed. So again, not really great evidence. This is more speculative based upon the literature I've seen. I'm a fan of any type of resistance training over not, but if you're looking to maximize bone development, I would certainly say you want to include some multi-joint movements. And I think just in general, there's other reasons why you'd want to as well.
Besides the squats, what are some other
rows, presses, push-ups, any type of movement where you're involving more than one joint.
For someone that doesn't, someone that's working with dumbbells, for example, who's not going to go use a machine, can you do multi-joint movements with dumbbells?
Shoulder press, chest press. Dumbbells are great, sure. Shoulder press, chest press. You can do squats. You can do a goblet squat where you hold the dumbbell here and do a squat. And,
Well, that was I didn't realize, I had a question there about bone density, but I didn't realize that it really does play a significant role in the bone densities. And it's really good to know about that. Muscle mass in general, aging, what about someone who hasn't, let's say, they're more of an endurance athlete, throughout most of their young adulthood, and they're getting into even just maybe perhaps older age. Is it ever too late to start resistance training to help build muscle mass or to help prevent the atrophy that's going to happen?
Absolutely not. So in my previous life, I was a personal trainer before becoming an educator researcher, and literally I was involved in the training of thousands of individuals, and I had clients at the time that were 60s, 70s, and 80s, never lifted a weight, and saw huge benefits in relatively short periods of time. We carried out a meta-analysis on the oldest of old, which was 70 and above. Although 70 is actually not that, it's the new 50 now is 70. But 70 plus years old and up to octogenarians, nonagenarians, profound improvements in muscle strength, muscle hypertrophy within 8 to 12 week training programs. These are novice trainees who've never done anything before. Now, I will say this with a caveat, it's always better to start when you're young. The earlier you start, the better. because once you start losing, to get it back is harder. So yeah, you can always improve upon where you're at a given point in time. But trying to get back to where you were when you're in your 20s is going to be almost impossible if you're not starting until you're 70. However, if you start when you're in your 20s, you can maintain a majority of your muscle mass. And certainly, I would say this, someone who is not doing anything in their 20s, I've had clients in their 70s who were stronger and more fit than people in their 20s who were serious lifters. So yeah, it's always best to start when you're younger. And I will say this too, for women in particular, and particularly in reference to bone density, it is very important to start early. Again, it's never too late because you can get some.
How early? How early?
20s? I mean, as early as you can, but certainly like in your teens and 20s, because you do build up a bone bank. I mean, the analogy I like to use is having a retirement account. If yeah, it's never too late to start technically, but if you start when you're in your 50s, your retirement is not going to be what it is if you start in your 20s. And there is this concept of a bone bank, where if you start when you're young, and particularly again for women who have the biggest issue with osteoporosis, you end up staving off the possibility of having osteoporosis. If you start when you've already lost bone density, it's very difficult to get back. You can stave off, you can certainly prevent the progression of osteoporosis, but getting back your bone density becomes much more difficult.
So it's very similar to this concept of building up a muscle reserve, right? Because that's also, right, when you hit your, I don't know, 30s even maybe.
Yeah.
You start to lose the muscle mass. And so, yeah, if you, like you said, starting with that bigger reserve is always better because things are going to be taking away from it. So you want to have like a bigger starting point. So that's really great to know because, in particular for women, I think, at least for myself in particular, and I know like many of my friends and growing up, even, throughout high school, I mean, we were always endurance. We were endurance athletes. You walk into the gym and there was mostly guys in there lifting weights, the wrestlers, and so I don't know that this may be changing now where women are starting to understand the importance of resistance training and building up muscle mass and bone mass through resistance training. But, for me, it was always endurance. If I'm doing my endurance, then I'm checking the box. I'm getting that exercise. I'm going to be healthier because of it. So this is all. It's really so important, I think, for young women too. To really, it's easier to convince young men who like want to get the muscle. I mean, for them, they've got other goals as well in mind. But I think there's now a growing interest in bone mass and bone density and preventing osteoporosis as well. So that's really great to know. What about starting young? Can you start like in childhood?
Absolutely. So there's compelling research now that children, it's never too young to start, provided the child's maturity is such that they're able to lift. I will say that always it should be done, especially early on. If you're dealing with children 6, 7, 8 years old, you want to have a fully supervised environment, even beyond that, until they are, in their teens even. But yeah, there's really compelling research now that resistance training in youth not only is not detrimental, so I mean, it does not, I want to dispel the myth now that it stunts growth. I mean, there's been this myth around forever that, that training, if you do resistance training early on, it will stunt your growth. There's zero evidence.
I would think the opposite because growth hormone increases with resistance training.
Yeah, growth hormone really does not have the effects on, interestingly, even though the name is growth hormone, it's really not the driving force of development. Well, it is on height. But
that's what I mean.
Growth hormone is pulsatile, and the effects on growth hormone it's actually interesting. It's never been studied, but it's pulsatile, and the effects on growth hormone with resistance training are very specific to the 1 hour or so after the workout. But it was thought that you would injure the epiphyseal plates in the bone that would, somehow stunt the growth. Anyway, zero evidence to that. The issues can be that if someone is not, I want to emphasize if a child is not emotionally and mentally ready for that. Yeah, if they get injured, but I'll say this, it's kind of, to me, it's always this weird thought process that parents often have no issues with letting their children play football and basketball. The possibility of getting injured and potentially breaking bones in sports, in these major sports, are much, much higher. Resistance training is one of the safest things you can do in a supervised environment. So yeah, with children, again, very young as 6, 7, 8 years old, there's been good, compelling research on this, that they can do it. I generally say you want to start off with lighter loads with them. And again, it's getting them into the feel for doing it. And look, when you're dealing with children, the most important thing is making it fun. So if something is not fun, you're forcing them to do it. Not only is it not going to work and you're going to have a rebellion against it, but it can also later on in life get them to a point where they're kind of adverse to doing that. So again, I think what's really important is to make it enjoyable for them, and it improves self-esteem. Obviously, it improves bullying in children. I mean, these are all things that can help to stave off a lot of the issues that children can have, makes them better athletes. So from a parent standpoint, you can get scholarships to make them, if that's the avenue they want to pursue, it can make them better in their sports and lead to just a host of positive improvements.
With respect to body composition, so, we were talking about the benefits of resistance training on bone density, obviously muscle mass, and people are now thinking about those things. But, back in the day, body composition, and it still is important as well, but that was kind of one of the major things people would think about, like why they should do resistance training. Can you talk like a little bit about body, like how does resistance training, affect body recomposition?
Sure.
Can you gain muscle without gaining fat mass? Sort of things like that.
All great questions. So, well, let's start from the basics that resistance training can improve. Certainly, it improves lean mass, which is largely muscle mass. I do think it's important to understand like certain measures, underwater weighing, like a lot of the measures that you'll see, DEXA, underwater weighing, BIA, bioelectrical impedance analysis. They are looking at not necessarily muscle mass, although there are ways to try to derive that. But when they talk about fat-free mass and lean mass, generally depending on the measure, they're combinations of, in the very least, muscle and water. So it's not necessarily just, if you're gaining water, that'll show up as fat-free mass. That's not, anything outside of fat mass would be fat-free mass. And that I think is somewhat important to understand there. But with that said, resistance training certainly can impact the fat-free mass aspect, and it can help with fat mass. Now, I want to say in general, and this goes for cardiovascular exercise too, exercise is not the best way to lose body fat. It can help. It's certainly, I think, a good adjunct to a fat loss program, which I'll get to in a second, but you have to do a lot of exercise to meaningfully lose fat, whereas it's just much easier to do it through reducing the calories and nutrition, the energy intake. So for instance, if you do an hour of cardiovascular exercise and hard, where you're running for the most part, I mean, you can burn 500-600 calories in that hour. You have a bag of potato chips that can pretty much offset everything you've done. Whereas if you focus on reducing the energy intake through your food and using exercise as an adjunct, it can certainly help with the weight loss, not only in terms of increasing energy expenditure to some extent, because by the way, doing an hour of exercise every day for most people is just not it becomes very laborious. And that's just cardio. Like I said, you want to do resistance training as well. And resistance training, cardio actually is somewhat more effective just purely from creating more energy expenditure than resistance training is. But here's the catch. It is, in my humble opinion, fundamental to combine resistance training at the very least with an energy deficit through nutritional restriction to promote weight loss. And here's why. If you do not lift weights, even if you just do cardio, you will lose muscle as you're losing body fat. And there are, depending upon how you're going about it, evidence shows 25% to 30% of the weight lost will come from muscle. So you might lose, let's say, 70% fat, and it can even be more if you're somewhat leaner, and 30% coming from lean mass if you don't do resistance training. Now, you talked about recomp. Resistance training not only will stave off the loss of fat-free mass often, but you can actually recomp. Recomp means you can gain muscle while losing fat. There are two primary factors, and I'll leave out, so there's three. The elephant in the room is anabolic steroid use. So if you're taking anabolic steroids, yeah, you can have serious recomp. But putting that aside, that's probably not your audience or most of the people listening here. The two primary factors are, number one, how much weight do you have to lose? So are you obese? The more weight you have to lose, the easier it is to recomp. Also, how long have you been training? So someone who has a lot of years of experience of training that's closer to their genetic ceiling will have a more difficult time recomping. Now, by the way, so if you have a lot of body fat to lose and you're just starting out, you can do serious recomp. I see this all the time. Not only anecdotally have I seen this in clients, but we have controlled experiments run through our lab where I see this all the time in individual subjects that we have. You cannot, however, maximize muscle mass while you are losing fat. So this is important. If your goal is to go into, let's say, a mass gaining cycle where you want to, let's say, bodybuilders do this or strength athletes, and your goal is to maximize muscle development, you're at the very minimum going to need to be at maintenance, and generally you're going to need to be in a small surplus where you're going to gain a little bit, at least some amount of fat.
Okay. Boy, this is fantastic information. It's sinking all in. So if you are in a caloric deficit, and this kind of brings us into the dietary protein requirements world a little bit. If you are in a caloric deficit, but you are, and we should probably talk about what the protein requirements are, but let's say you are getting sufficient protein intake, daily protein intake to prevent your body from pulling protein out of your muscle, basically. Can you not lose the lean mass or muscle mass? Let's say you're not doing resistance training, but you are just getting the protein in. And say you're doing aerobic, but you're still in the caloric deficit, but you're getting the protein.
And not lifting weights.
You're not lifting weights.
So the answer is it will help to preserve some lean mass, but you're still, no matter what if you are not lifting weights, I mean, this has been shown again over and over in research, you will lose. And well, I want to I always hate to talk in absolutes, because if you're very obese, where you just have let's say you're 100 pounds overweight, you can lose fat without losing muscle much more readily, because you just have so much fat to lose that the body's going to pull from the fat stores. But I'm talking when you're starting to get down into people who just are quote unquote overweight, you're going to lose muscle if you do not resistance train. Now, even if, I want to point out though, even if you're lifting weights, if you are getting insufficient protein, you're going to leach some muscle. So you need to still take in sufficient protein. And there's actually evidence that you need more protein than what has been shown for people at maintenance or above to maintain muscle or even to gain it slightly when you're in a caloric deficit. So that actually increases protein needs to some extent.
Can you talk about what those requirements
are?
So
we start to get into generalizations. So the general literature shows somewhere around 1.6 to 1.8 grams per kilogram per day of protein is required for resistance trained people, which is about double the RDA. So RDA for sedentary individuals is around 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. You need roughly double that to maintain or to promote anabolism while you're resistance training. in the upper confidence interval is about 2.2 grams per kilogram. So meaning that to really be on the safe side, for the vast majority of people, if you're in the Gen Pop, it's probably not going to make a difference. But if you're a bodybuilder, when I'm coaching bodybuilders and consulting with them, it really does not hurt to take in more protein. I mean, there's a lot of myths about kidney damage. In healthy individuals, no good evidence that there's any negative effects on renal function, certainly on bone density. These are all unsupported from my reading of the literature. So there's not necessarily a downside to it. You have to look at cost benefit. Everything is cost benefit. For bodybuilders, I would say go up to 2 grams per kilogram per day, which is roughly around, for those of us in the States, it's about 1 gram per pound. It's not going to hurt. But I would say that becomes even more important to stay in that upper realm. So if you're like 1.6, if you're especially in a surplus, you generally need, the needs for protein are going to be encompassed because the body isn't going to leach protein needs. When you start getting into a deficit, that's where I think it becomes even more important to be at that upper realm, that 2.0, 2.2 grams per kilogram.
So people that are, let's say people that are obese, and I always say obese or overweight, and maybe it's important to distinguish these two based on what you just said, but if they are obese and or like, overweight, and they're wanting to lose fat mass, right? Should they be calculating their protein intake based on their targeted weight? Or because if they're like, 300 pounds, for example, or, that's a lot of protein, right?
Yeah,
so.
it's a great question, and the answer is no. So the protein needs have been based on men and women who are relatively lean. I want to say relatively for the vast majority of the population, they would consider it lean. So for guys, somewhere like in the 12 to 15% body fat range. For women, around 20% body fat or so. So if you are 300 pounds and you should be 200 pounds, you would want, let's say you would calculate it at your, the weight that you would be where you would be at your lean weight, where, for a guy, 12 to 15% body fat. So we can then regress to saying, base it on lean mass, but most people aren't getting DEXA scans to determine their lean mass, or even, they're not going out and getting body fat caliper measurements, just not in the realm of what most people are going to do. And you can make a general estimate. These are not precise measurements. It's not like, people think that we're doing these experiments and they really nail it down into these precise areas. They're generalized recommendations based upon what we know, and there's going to be variations around the mean. You're always going to have people that are, when we do research, we report the means, as you well know, which are the averages. But people aren't an average. You get some people that are up here, some people here, and they average out to here. So so if you're overweight, obese, you want to figure your protein needs at what you would be at a relatively lean weight. Let's say, again, for a guy, 10, 12, 15% body fat. I will say this, it doesn't hurt to take in, like I said, a little extra protein. That's, on the good side, protein is very difficult to store as body fat, much more difficult than carbohydrates and fat. So it's, if you're going to err on the side of caution, that's where you'd want to err on the side of taking in a little more protein at the expense, if your goal is weight loss, at the expense of carbs and fat.
Right. Now we had Stuart Phillips on the podcast, a colleague of yours, and he was talking about with the protein requirements, like the buy-in being more like, just to get like at least 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. And for me, I was like, okay, because that's what I'm going to try to aim for. But then, as I started to become more do more resistance training, I realized I was meeting the buy-in, but I wasn't meeting the 1.6. And so I have to now increase, like a can of sardines will get me there. Like I need about 16 to 20 more grams a day. So, for people like my dad, for example, he's in his 70s and good luck getting him to 1.6. Like I'm trying to get him to 1.2, right? I'm trying to prevent him from just, completely depleting his, his amino acids from his muscle every day, which he's kind of doing. So he has to supplement and do the protein shakes and stuff like that. And I'm happy at least to get him there. next step would be then 1.6, and of course, adding the resistance training, which should be essential, but I haven't been able to get to that point yet. So I wanted to mention that with the protein requirements because, there was I know the RDA is so low, 0.8, and Stuart talked a little bit about some of the flaws in the early studies that were done to calculate that. And I'm just wondering, when is it time to reassess this, and change it? Because a lot of people think they're getting enough protein, and many people don't even get the RDA.
So to address that, two things I think that are important. So 1.2 is better than 0.8, certainly. But I mean, there's good literature showing, we've done work on this, that if you want to maximize anabolism, so again, it doesn't mean that you're not going to gain any muscle if you're taking in 1.2, but it will impair the gains that you're going to get, and especially when you're talking about older individuals where they're anabolically resistant. So it becomes even more important. And I think this is another important thing when you're dealing with older individuals, their resistance, not only anabolically resistance to resistance training, but also to protein, where the per dose aspects need to be higher to some extent to get what's called leucine, which is one of the essential amino acids. And there's, I don't know how deep you want to get here, but there's a leucine threshold. Leucine is the amino acid that seems to kickstart the muscle growth process. And if it seems to be somewhat higher, at least some of the literature does show that in older individuals, getting more leucine is important to kickstart that process. As you point out, though, unfairly, for older individuals, it becomes increasingly difficult to get protein in. And I'm a big fan of whole foods. Supplementation is something that you do when you cannot get whole foods in. But as you get older, taste buds start to dissipate. Your food does not have good taste. So older individuals have difficulty chewing sometimes too. And that is where supplementation can come in. It's much easier to drink a whey protein or a casein or egg protein shake and get that protein in through supplemental means if you're not meeting your daily requirements. So I think that's where, and for anyone, I mean, women, it seems that women often also are not programmed to take protein as much. And it's just very easy to do through protein shakes if you're not going to be able to do it through whole foods.
What's the leucine threshold? Can you, in terms of protein, obviously, we can get into the vegan, vegetarian, because it's a whole other thing. But if you're eating meat, chicken, poultry, fish, if you're getting the essential amino acids, what gram dose per meal would you say would be important for that crossing that leucine threshold, and what age?
Yeah, so these aren't, again, hard cutoffs in either of those. I've seen 3 grams where it starts to increase from 2 to 3 grams of leucine as you get older. Where is that cutoff from being quote unquote older? There isn't one. And if you don't necessarily, I certainly don't think you need to take leucine as a supplement if you're taking in a high quality protein source. If you're eating meat-based proteins, which by the way aren't just meat, they're also milk and eggs, etc. So proteins from animal-based sources. You're going to be getting quality proteins that are rich in leucine. And again, it's just getting the proper dosages in, which might be, it's been shown there is a graded, there's a recent study out of Luc van Loon's lab, who's a terrific researcher, protein researcher in the Netherlands. And they looked at, again, my memory now, it's been a while since I looked at this study, but they did 0, 15 grams of protein. I believe they used whey, 30 and 45, I think it was. But anyway, it showed a dose-response relationship for muscle protein synthesis where they kept getting a greater response. Now, it did seem to somewhat the curve wasn't a linear relationship, so there was more parabolic where it started to trail off after 30 grams, but it did continue on above the 30 grams. So it just shows that in older individuals that it's needed to take more per dose protein to hit that leucine threshold, particularly in the time after resistance training.
I mean, yeah, that's talking about a dose that you're going to have in your animal products, but then you're also probably going to have a protein shake with it because It's quite, I mean, I guess unless you can eat large steaks and stuff. But for me, I know as a female too,
Well,
I
mean,
won't be
4
getting.
ounces of chicken is 30 grams of protein
Is it
or so.
30?
So yeah,
Okay.
I mean, it's four. You know, if you get
I eat 4 ounces of chicken.
yeah,
That's,
so it's
pretty good. With respect to what we were talking about with the being in a caloric deficit and gaining muscle mass and how it's, you know, you have to do the resistance training and get the protein, but it seems as though gaining isn't, you're not going to be really gaining if you're in that caloric deficit, if you're the person that is actively doing caloric restriction for recomp, like, you know, I guess aspects. But what about, you know, so like something I practice is time restricted eating, where I like to eat all my food within a 10-hour window. You know, I don't go too crazy, but you know, like I like to have a resting period. And you know, when you're not digesting and all that, you are in a repair process, right? You're in repair mode. The problem that a lot of people make with time restricted eating is they go, oh, in order to eat within this 10-hour window, I have to skip breakfast, right? So they skip meals, which ends up being caloric restriction in, you know, combined with the time restricted eating. And so what I do is not skip meals. I do not skip breakfast. I do not skip meals, unless, you know, there's some circumstantial thing that happens where I have to get somewhere or whatever, right? But if I'm getting all of my protein within that 10-hour window, so it's more of it's a intermittent fasting, but not being in a caloric deficit. So getting the same calories that I would get if I was eating my food throughout the day. And then I'm adding in resistance training, making sure I'm eating the protein. Is that going to be conducive with gaining muscle mass?
yeah, absolutely. So I mean, we actually are starting to get some good research on this topic now. Time restricted feeding. It's interesting you bring that up. I have a paper currently in review, or a review paper currently in review with my colleague Alan Aragon, who's a big nutritional expert, and we covered this exact topic. The interesting thing with time restricted feeding, number one, there's various iterations of it. So there's 420. So we have 4 hours eating and then 20 hours off. There's 618. There's 816. So there's all variations. Then there's also the 2-5 concept, where you fast for 2 days and then eat 5 days. So a lot of that will depend upon the specific type of time restricted feeding. What you're talking about, a 10-hour window, is much more friendly towards anabolism. But most of them, it's interesting because conceivably spacing out your protein would logically have benefits. And there's been some research, even longitudinal research, that backs this up, that you get better utilization of protein if it's spread out, let's say, at least over 3 meals, relatively spaced, like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and perhaps even 4. But now again, so this is where the nuances come in. If you're a bodybuilder, I would recommend trying to take in protein across the day as much as possible, because when you're not eating, you're catabolic. Eating is anabolic. So when not eating is catabolic. But for these studies on time-restricted feeding really don't show much difference. Now, our measures that we have, our current measures of looking at hypertrophy, or even MRI, which is the gold standard, still has a margin of error. It's not like we're doing, you're looking at a cadaver and you're actually measuring, or you're doing like rodent research where you actually can weigh the muscle, et cetera. So our measures might not be sensitive enough to detect subtle differences, but for the vast majority of people, I mean, you're not looking to bodybuild, it's just not going to be much of a difference. If you're going to do a 420, I would say you're then going to be in a lot more, and there's been research, there's one study certainly showed diminished anabolic, diminished muscle hypertrophy with a 420 versus a traditional eating pattern. I could see where a 2.5 might have issues. So again, I would say if you're going to, whatever you do, try to structure your training within that eating window that you have, because, and there's actually been quite a lot of research on this, that the body is highly anabolic for at least 24 hours, if not more, after a workout. But when you start getting outside of 6-8 hours or so, it's probably going to trail off, where you might not harvest some of the gains, depending upon what you're looking for. Especially if your goals are more optimizing muscle mass. So I would say it's beneficial to try to get the feeding in within that window, whatever it is. If you're going to be, let's say, in a 10-hour window, try to train within the earlier part of that eating, so that you're going to be able to eat after your workout and not go, let's say, not do it right after your final meal and then be catabolic for 14 hours.
Okay, so is there some, with the anabolic window, is there some,
It's
you're
really,
kind of
it's really a
touching
barn
about it.
door. Yeah, we've done a ton of research on this. So certainly there is somewhat of a window. And even in the paper we published, which people take, there's no anabolic window. That's not what our research showed, but it showed that it's really minor. The much more important thing is getting your total daily protein intake in. And that's what we're kind of, to your point, if you're hitting your daily protein requirements, if whatever your window is, if you're doing, let's say, certainly 10 hours, but even like a 8-16, which is the most common time-restricted feeding strategy. If you're getting 1.6 grams per kilogram, you're pretty good. You're going to get the majority of your gains regardless. Then it starts to come down. You kind of mentioned this with Stu Phillips in similar veins. That's kind of like now you're starting to get more like the cherry on the sundae here, if you want to eke out the maximum amount of gains. And really, it's, like I said, more of a barn door. It's not this narrow window. And I think what we've debunked is that after 45 minutes, oh my God, I got to slam my shake immediately after training or I go catabolic. And even if you're an advanced bodybuilder, I don't think there's utility. The utility in that is virtually nil. But I do say, like, when I'm coaching bodybuilders, get your protein in as quickly as you can after a workout. You don't have to stress and slam your shake the minute you finish your last set. But because this is where even small amounts of gains can be the difference between winning and losing a competition. So again, it's highly context specific. We try to make these general guidelines and apply it to the population, but everyone has their own goals, their own lifestyle that they have to deal with, and other factors, and that needs to be taken into account.
If you are working out at home, let's say, and you can go, and you're not a professional bodybuilder, you're a recreational, I guess I wouldn't call it a gym goer if you're doing it at home, but you're a recreational at-home gym goer, and you can go and take your shake right after your workout because you're at home and it's not stressful and you don't have to think about packing it and all this. I mean, would that...
Not going to hurt, and it could have, even if it helps a tiny bit,
right.
I would say that is the cost benefit where there is really no cost and a potential very small benefit. Now, again, if you start going longer and longer, if you're taking 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, and again, if you're doing let's say 10-14, and you train right after your last meal, and then go 14 hours, then you can start compromising some gains. So there's no hard rule to this. It's on a spectrum, but I would say the quicker you can get it in, conceivably, the better. It's just no downside to it.
With your, you mentioned the aging study where the fellow from the Netherlands was looking at, I guess, on a per meal effect with respect to protein intake and muscle protein synthesis. Is it like, you're not going to have most people aren't going to do 3 meals with 40 or 50 grams of protein without supplementing on top of that. Maybe there's some people that will do it, but not all the women, not all the older folks. For the majority, I think, of those types of people, they might not be taking in that much protein per meal. Should they try to at least get 40 grams in at least one meal? Or is 30 enough? So is 40 better than 30 for these older people? Is it something they should even think about? Or is it just the cherry on top, but you don't stress yourself kind of thing?
Yeah, it's great questions. And one of the things I think that needs to be understood is that the studies are sterile. So what I mean by that is that they're taking people, they're going to look at kind of proof of principle. So they take them fasted, they're having nothing in their body, and they're giving them let's say a whey protein shake. Whey is a very fast-acting protein that gets into your body very quickly, into your circulatory system. The body gets to use the amino acids quickly. When you're eating a whole meal, the amino acids are released in a much more time-released fashion because the body has to digest the food, break it down. There's fats that are going to delay absorption. So again, you're eating, let's say, chicken with broccoli and rice, etc. You're eating a whole meal. There's time delayed release of nutrients into your body. So you don't, that's why I said the most important thing, 90% is targeting your, I hate to give exact percentages because I'm just pulling that out of the air, but I just want to emphasize the vast majority is getting your worrying about getting your total daily protein intake, stressing over this, minutia of how much is in the meal. If an older individual is taking in 1.6 grams, they're going to be doing fine. They're not going to be meaningfully compromising their gains unless they're looking to bodybuild, do a master's level bodybuilding show.
Okay, well that's good to know. I mean, for the people like us, shifting a little bit into mechanics and like the training load. I mean, that's a big one. I mean, for the longest time, I remember you'd hear lift heavy or lift big or go home or something like that. I mean,
go heavy or go home.
Yeah, that's it. Like, what does the science say about that? Like, you've really contributed to this area about, do you need to train heavy to get your gains?
So this is an area that I've done pretty much so I've changed my opinion on it. So many things that, that I had learned as an up and coming sports scientist, and that were treated as dogma, in textbooks, that my views have, in certain respects, done 180, and nothing can be characterized more so than loading. So I had always thought that if you're doing anything over 12 to 15 repetitions, it's basically glorified cardio, and that, it's just muscle endurance. You're not going to gain muscle. The literature is now compellingly shown. There's so much literature on the topic. Our lab has done quite a bit of research, as well as many others. And it shows that you can gain similar amounts of muscle, regardless of the loading, across a wide range of loading spectrums, up to 30 to even 40 repetitions, which is a long set. And that's at the whole muscle level. Now there may be, and I want to really emphasize, this is still equivocal. There may be some muscle fiber type specific benefits to doing light loads for type 1 fibers and type 2 fibers for heavy loads. If you're asking me my confidence in that literature, it's modest at best. But I can't rule out that would be the case. But when you're looking, let's say, at MRI data or ultrasound, which we've used extensively, really shows no difference. And I'll tell you what I think is a quite funny story looking back. But Stu Phillips had published a study circa 2012, and he went on social media, it was Facebook at the time, and it was on untrained subjects doing leg extensions. And it showed that there was no difference in whole muscle hypertrophy between 30% 1RM, which is like 30 reps, versus 80% 1RM, which was like 8 reps. And I remember it as clear as day saying, Stu, come on, this is untrained subjects doing leg extensions. They get jacked from doing spin cycling. That was, I think, my exact quote. And I said, I'm going to do this study in trained individuals. You're going to see there's going to be no question the older individuals are going to need the heavier loads to get those highest threshold motor units, the type 2 fibers, into play. And lo and behold, I carried out that study and no difference. It was really ate crow. And since then, there's just been so much evidence, not only just across the spectrum of populations, untrained, trained, older, younger, men, women, really any and every population has been extensively studied. And it really is a beautiful thing because it provides so much flexibility and options to carry out resistance training. And it's particularly, I think, beneficial for issues like training through injuries. So if you're training through injuries, heavy loading can be contraindicated. And also particularly for the older individuals, because joint-related issues, as you know, as people get older, they get osteoarthritis and other joint-related issues where heavy loading can be very uncomfortable for them and perhaps debilitating. And so it's kind of contraindicated. And they can use lighter loads. Now, the caveat to this is that the lighter loads have to be taken with a high degree of effort. So they have to really, if you do not extensively challenge your muscles, meaning that the last few reps are difficult to complete, you're not going to achieve gains. So when I talk about light loads, it's not this, taking pink dumbbells and just, doing some lifting. Okay, I stop. You must challenge the muscle. So when you lift heavier, just innately you're going to challenge the muscles regardless, because the weight is already heavy. With lighter loads, the first number of repetitions are very easy to complete. And if it's easy to complete, you're really not doing much for challenging. And this goes back to a survival mechanism. So the reason that the body, I think this is important, because the reason that the body adapts to strength training is survival. The reason that the body adapts to anything is through a survival mechanism. And if you are not challenging it in a way it is not accustomed to being challenged, it has no impetus to adapt. So the reason that you will get these adaptations in strength and power and hypertrophy, muscle endurance, bone density, etc., is because the muscles and bones, etc., tendons, ligaments are being challenged beyond their present capacity.
And so as you get stronger, then you have to push past that and challenge them more. So the big take home for lifting lighter, which is what I tend to do, is to get fatigued, right, when you're doing it. And so it often means more reps, which I enjoy doing. I've done both, and I do find for me, I like doing the lighter lifting and more reps versus doing heavier and fewer reps. And I also notice I'm less likely to injure my wrist if I'm doing, and now maybe that wouldn't, if I was doing things like proper form and all that, maybe it wouldn't be such an issue. But you mentioned the muscle type 1 and type 2 fibers, and maybe there's some evidence that lifting a little heavier might help shift a little bit more type 2. Can you talk just for a moment, like what are the roles of those types of fibers, and should people aim to kind of gain both of those, or are there distinct differences, in terms of with aging, their roles in aging?
Yeah. So great questions. So I'll tackle the second question first. So yes, aging is mostly specific. So when I say aging, what's called sarcopenia, which is the age-related loss of muscle, is most specific to the type 2 fibers, which are your strength-related fibers. So just to kind of even circle back, for those who don't know, type 1 fibers are endurance-oriented fibers. They do not produce force as well as type 2 fibers, but they're indefatigable. They can go on for longer periods of time. They're hard to fatigue. Whereas your type 2 fibers fatigue relatively easily, but they have the capacity to produce greater force. As you age, the type 1 fibers are more well preserved, where the type 2 fibers, there's even what's called apoptosis, which has been shown there's a loss of fibers, but certainly there's a diminishment where the fibers get smaller and smaller. It's more specific. The sarcopenic effect is more specific to the type 2 fibers, which is obviously problematic because the ability to produce force is where your primary functional capacity, at least from being able to open cans and jars, avoiding falls, etc. Circling back, so then the training effect, I want to emphasize, you're going to train, if you are training hard, regardless of heavy, light, you're going to be targeting both 1 and 2 fibers. So we're talking now nuance. So if I think this is where this kind of gets lost in context, where I think this would have the greatest, if it is in fact true, greatest relevance would be to, let's say, bodybuilders who want to maximize their muscle development. It probably is beneficial to utilize some heavier training and some lighter training so that you at least make sure you're kind of hedging your bets and make sure that you're maximizing development of all fibers. For the average individual, if you are training hard, regardless of light or heavy, you're going to be getting type 1 and type 2 fiber development. And it's been well documented that light load training does target the type 2 fibers, which that was one of the myths. It used to be taught when I was an up-and-coming sports scientist that if you just used light loads, you would not activate the highest threshold motor units, which are associated with these type 2 fibers. And thus, you would not optimize your strength and power and hypertrophy.
So we were talking about the resistance training, we've mentioned strength training, and then there's power training, and I think this probably has a little bit to do with what you just mentioned with the problem with aging, right? And so can you just briefly talk about the differences and maybe where, like, does one shine more than the other with respect to like what older individuals should be doing or focusing on? Or is it like, or, women versus men? Is there any differences there as well?
So the definitions do somewhat vary depending upon who you ask. I'll give you mine. So resistance training is kind of a catch-all for any type of exercise that moves against resistance. This would be body weight exercise, push-ups, pull-ups, body weight squats would be resistance exercise. Free weights, machines, cables, any of these would be considered resistance exercise. Strength training often is used synonymously with resistance training, but also it can be thought of as specific to, let's say, powerlifting, where you're moving very heavy loads, and necessarily when you're lifting heavy loads, you're moving them very slowly. You can't, if I give you a very heavy load to lift, you can't move that fast, or you'd be able to do more than whatever you're doing. You'd be able to do more repetitions than what you're doing. Whereas power is the ability to produce force over time, so more quickly. The more rapidly you can produce force, the more power you generate. Power is developed on a foundation of strength, but it also involves this time component. And there is evidence that at least some training needs to be done, quote unquote, explosively. So moving weights quickly, or when I say weights, doing resistance quickly, to generate maximal power. And our group was involved recently in a meta-analysis on older individuals that showed functional improvements were optimized when they did training that involved moving the concentric action quickly and then doing a controlled eccentric. So I do think it's important for older individuals to incorporate some power training in their programs. It doesn't mean that every set needs to be done in this respect, but at least having some of the training that will be devoted towards power training. And I think it's really exemplified by the fact that hip fractures. So when older individuals fall, and it's a frequent thing now, particularly in those who are sedentary, they are not able to quickly reverse their fall and avoid the resultant effect of a hip fracture. And studies show that older individuals, when they get a hip fracture, it's been a while since I've looked at the literature. I think it was 50% never recover full function and die within, I think, 2 years. Half of them go into convalescence. They have to be under constant care. They're not able to be functionally independent. So, I mean, it's a big thing. Whereas a younger individual, they can get their cast signed by their friends or whatever, and it's not a big deal. But older individuals, these are really important issues that you want to stave off. And I would say that having some power training, and then again, other types of training. This is another thing I think is really important. We often think in binary terms, train this way, not that way, or there's programs that are devoted, this is how you should train. We should be thinking of training as combining different concepts to a given goal, because often doing some lighter load training with some heavier load training, if possible. Sometimes that's not possible, but sometimes it is. Doing, like I said, some power training with heavier load training, or lighter load, moderate training. These are things that ultimately can optimize the effects for a given goal.
For thinking about the power training for me, I would think, well, it sounds like it would be easier if I had lighter weights. Is that still considered power training if they're, or does it have to be like a heavier, like a fast movement with a heavier?
No. Again, you're not going to be able to move heavy and lighter relative terms. So if you're using a very let's say you're doing what's called a 3RM, the maximum amount of weight you can lift 3 times. Let's say I'm doing a bench press with a 3RM. Even on my first rep, if I try to move it fast, I'm not going to be able to, because the load, if I could, I'd be able to do more than 3 reps with that. So you're going to have to choose a weight that is relatively light. Let's say you're able to do a minimum of 10 repetitions or 10 repetitions. So again, light exists on the spectrum. 8 is lighter than 3. 3 reps is heavier than 8 reps. 8 reps would be heavier than 15 reps. 15 reps. So at what point is that, that optimal effect? There's no research that indicates that at this point, where you're not going to be able to use heavy. It'll be above, let's say, 8. I'd say you'd have to go a minimum, as light as a minimum of 8 repetitions, 8 RM. If you could do more, if you could do a heavier load, you're not going to be able to move it quickly enough to get that benefit. And by the way, there's other things you could do. You can do plyometric training. Now, for some older people, that can be somewhat dangerous. But I mean, you can throw a medicine ball. That's a way of power training. So take a medicine ball. I mean, older people can easily do that. Where for the upper body, these are good upper body movements that would be, I think, very user-friendly for people that are older. It can be fun, which again, it's kind of, we do see kind of this trajectory from youth to getting into our adulthood and then aging, where making it fun again, a lot of times is important for older people.
What about, so you mentioned with the lifting lighter and, you know, the important thing of basically fatiguing yourself, right? Like you can't just do a couple and it's like, you know, compare that to lifting heavier and doing a couple, right? This whole idea of training till failure, and what does that mean? Do we need to train till failure? Is that important?
Yeah, so failure, for an operational definition, would be the inability to perform another repetition with proper form. And we carried out a meta-analysis recently on this topic, and the bottom line is that, and that's kind of the go hard or go home philosophy. You know, that's the bodybuilding mentality of go hard or go home. Every set needs to be taken to failure. The evidence does not indicate that's the case. So certainly you need to train with a high amount of effort. But to take, certainly to take every set to failure is not only is it not, doesn't show any benefit for hypertrophy, it actually showed a small detriment for strength. So with strength, stopping a couple reps short of failure seemed to have better effects on maximizing strength than training to failure. Again, there are some limitations to that research. How much of that, does that mean that if you train to failure, you won't maximize your strength? I'm not necessarily on board with that, but that is what our results showed. I also would not dismiss the fact that for very high level, let's say you're very close to your genetic ceiling, that it might make the need to go to failure, at least on some of the sets, more relevant, beneficial. We don't have this is purely speculative on my end, but I can see at least a logical rationale where it makes your challenge, it's a way to challenge the body in a way that it is not used to. I will tell you that when I coach bodybuilders, I generally incorporate some failure training, but another area where my view has shifted, maybe not 180, but probably 90 degrees, where I used to be the go hard, go home dude who every set need to be taken to failure, and now most sets within 2 to 3 reps of failure. So there's a concept called the repetitions in reserve, and a 0, it's the RIR scale, repetitions in reserve. An RIR of 0 means you're at failure, means you cannot have done another rep. There's 0 reps left before you go to failure. An RIR of 1 would mean that you could have done one more rep, and at that rep you would be at failure. From the literature, although we don't have a definitive way of making estimates on this, but my own interpretation of the literature is somewhere between probably 1 to 3 RIR, reps from failure, would be needed to promote optimal adaptations. You can still see adaptations, particularly when you're more in the newbie stage, in the early stages, below that. But 1 to 3, I think, is a good general recommendation that's necessary to see adaptations. Again, then you start getting into the weeds, getting into the nuances. For the Gen Pop, I probably would say that's always going to be effective, and you probably never have to go to failure for the goals of most Gen Pops. For bodybuilders, high-level athletes, perhaps some failure training, the last set to failure on some of your exercises at least. And again, you want to get into the weeds, probably using your single joint and machine-based exercises would be more appropriate for failure, let's say, than squats, or a biceps curl, a lateral raise, a leg extension. They're going to be, first of all, there's less issue of injury, because when you're going to failure, let's say in a squat, and if you've ever squatted, and you're in the hole and you're trying to push out, there's a greater potential for injury, certainly you're going to need a spotter in that regard, or else you could be stuck and you can have problems with a bench press where you're trying to do that rep. If you don't have a spotter, that bar is stuck to your chest. Whereas if you're doing, let's say, dumbbell curls or lateral raises, at the very least, you're not going to be really torched after your sets. You're going to be able to come back strong. So these are just general, it's speculative on my part, but I think there's good logical rationale behind these things. And I do want to say that an evidence-based approach, so I do want to promote, one of the things my biggest hobby horse in life is to promote the importance of evidence-based practice. It is not simply deferring to research. Research is never going to tell you what to do, or virtually never. It's going to provide general guidelines, particularly in the applied sciences like exercise and nutrition. It will get you into the ballpark, give you general strategies to use. You then need to take this to the individual. What are their genetics? What is their lifestyle, their stress level, their sleep, their nutritional status, all of these things together. And then, of course, goals are going to enter into it. So developing a program from the research means to understand the research and then to use your own expertise in combination with the goals and abilities of the individual.
Right. With the designing the training program sort of aspect, we're kind of, sort of talking about this and, the training till failure, it sounds like that's pretty clear for me. Like, maybe the bodybuilders, that's a little bit more important. But for most people, getting within 1 to 3 reps until failure kind of answers you get a lot of questions about how many reps do I need to do? How many reps do I need to do? It sounds like it depends on the person. And when you start to feel that fatigue, when you're getting close, right? Like, so that's kind of what I'm thinking for myself. Resting between those reps or between the sets, or which way is it? The resting intervals.
Between sets.
It's between the sets. So, so basically when you're getting ready to do another set, like how many sets do you need to do, or how long do you have to rest between them? Is that important?
Yeah, so again, it's on a spectrum and it depends on, so when I talk to my students, they'll ask me questions and I say, pretty much any applied question you're going to ask me, I will answer with an it depends, because within broad spectrums, you can gain, if you're doing a very minimalist routine, you can make gains. So if you're saying, is it important? It starts to become more and more important, the more important it is to you to maximize your results. If your goal is just to build some muscle, gain some strength, a very minimalist routine, training an hour a week, let's say 2 days, 2 half-hour sessions a week can give you most people, very nice results, provided you're training hard. Is that going to, if you're looking to be a bodybuilder, or you're going to step on stage? No, I would say with 100% confidence that is not going to be sufficient to optimize your gains. So volume has been shown to be a driver of hypertrophy. Again, we've done original research on this. We've done meta-analytic work. And there is a dose-response relationship up to a certain point. It is individual specific as well. So some people respond better to, or respond well to lower volumes. Some people need more volume to maximize their results. Hard to study individual responses, but these are kind of general insights that we glean from the literature. But I would say, as a general guideline, to optimize hypertrophy, you want to be somewhere between 10 to 20 sets per muscle per week. Now, that's not going to be able to be done doing 2 half-hour sessions per week. But we recently published a review paper called No Time to Lift. It's open access. You can maybe post on this podcast the link to that, or show the image of the study. But we basically kind of looked at what is your minimal effective dose. And that was roughly around 4 sets per week, per muscle per week, which again can be done maximum 3 half-hour sessions, 2 to 3 half-hour sessions per week. You can get very nice results. And I think get probably, for most people, the majority of gains in that period of time. And then if you want more, you're going to have to devote more time.
Are there certain strategies that can be, so we were talking about like powerlifting, are there certain things that can be done to, be able to not have to have as much time as well? I mean, certain types of exercises?
Yeah, so a couple things. Number one, or several. First of all, training with lighter loads, while again, it's a very viable option, it does extend the time of the workout. So if you're training, let's say with 30 reps, the set's going to take triple the amount of time if you're training with 10 reps. So that, if you're very time pressed, can be a consideration. Now, how much that, depending upon how many sets you're doing, if you're doing minimalistic training, it's probably not adding that much time on. If you're doing a lot of volume, it can be more extensive. But using multi-joint exercises, so again, multi-joint is more than one joint. Presses, rows, squats, deadlifts, push-ups, chin-ups. These are exercises that involve multiple muscle groups and a lot of stabilizer muscles. They're much more time efficient than doing, let's say, a bicep curl. So when you're doing, let's say, a lat pull down or a chin-up, you're working your biceps very effectively. You're performing elbow flexion in addition to working your lats. The sternal portion of your pecs even are working in many of the stabilizer muscle groups. Squats involve many muscle groups, really the total lower body, and even stabilizers in your torso. So I would say focus more on your multi-joint exercise. And then you can use various time efficient strategies. So kind of these advanced training methods such as a superset, which is doing 2 different exercises. And there's different ways to structure these. There's something called a paired set, where you do agonist-antagonist movements such as, so the biceps and triceps are agonist-antagonist muscles, meaning that when one is contracting, one is shortening, the other is lengthening per se. So if you do a biceps curl, you can immediately do a triceps press down after that, and really you're working the muscles in different fashion. You don't have to rest between the sets. You could do a leg exercise followed by so lower body followed by an upper body exercise. Again, you're working different muscle groups, so it's more time efficient. You don't have to take the rest. If you're going to do, let's say, sets of chest press, so let's say I do the typical traditional way of doing sets is you do a set, then you rest, then you do another set for the same muscle group, you rest. That's going to take more time because you're going to have to rest between those sets. There is something called drop sets where you can do a set to failure, or certainly close to failure. Then you drop the weight. I don't mean drop literally, but you reduce the amount of load. So let's say, for instance, you have a rack of dumbbells and you use 20-pound dumbbells for curls. You can then, when you finish, you're getting really difficult on those last reps, you then go to the 15-pound dumbbells and you do more reps because you're lightening the load, you're able to do more weights. You can do triple drops. So you go from 20 to 15 to 10 to 5 even, and just do them without any rest and then not do any more sets. So rather than doing multiple sets, you just do this one long drop set. Now, is that as effective as doing multiple sets of the same muscle? We don't have enough evidence to show, but I do think we have enough where I would confidently say for the Gen Pop, it will be just or close to as effective. I don't think for the majority of the populations it will make much difference. Again, for the high-level athlete bodybuilder, it might. And that's where, again, context is important.
Where this idea of resting, this is great information because typically the way I work out, which is far from bodybuilder level, I don't rest in between sets, but I immediately switch to the next thing. And then I'll eventually go back to that first muscle group I was working. So I'll have, like 3 different muscle groups and I'm doing them lighter and faster. And then, so if you are doing a set, like why is it important to rest in between the set? Is it like something to do with like muscle protein synthesis or what?
Well, I mean, if you're going to, let's say you're going to do 4 sets of chest presses, you have to rest because if you're training really hard at that last rep, you pick up the weight, let's say in 2 seconds, you're not going to be able to do it. By default, if you're training very hard, you're not going to be able to do any more reps or else then you're at failure. So you have to have some degree of rest. Now, if you're resting very short periods, let's say you you're resting 30 seconds. The amount of load that you're going to be able to do will be much less, or the amount of reps at the same load. And this is actually interesting. So it had always been promoted. This is another area where I've shifted my thought processes. But it had been promoted that resting shorter was better for muscle hypertrophy. So what I've been taught when I was an up-and-coming strength and conditioning professional, that if you want strength, you take long rest, like 3 minutes in between your sets. And for hypertrophy, it's like 30 seconds to a minute, because that will maximize the hormonal response. So in between sets, or depending on the type of training that you are doing, shorter rest intervals will promote, interset rest intervals will promote greater growth hormone, testosterone, and IGF-1 responses after the workout is over. The literature, and that used to be thought to be a main driver of hypertrophy, the compelling body of literature now shows that it probably doesn't have, if it does have an effect, it would be very modest, and it might not even have any effect at all. So certainly it would not be something that I consider would be important to take into account. And the issue is that volume load, the total amount of weight that you lift in a given session, which is the amount of work that you're doing, does seem to be a factor. So let's say I'm doing a set of squats with 200 pounds for 10 reps, and then I rest 30 seconds between, I'll try to do another one after 30 seconds. Let's say I try to use that same 200 pounds, I'm not getting anywhere near 10 reps. And based on the literature that we have, I'm probably only getting 5 reps. Whereas if I would rest 2 minutes, I'd be able to get much closer to that 10 reps. And if I rested 3, even more. And that's why it's actually been shown that resting short, having short rest periods between sets, if you're doing a certain number of sets and you're resting short, taking short rest, it actually compromises hypertrophy. So it's actually has a negative effect, giving greater credence to the fact that at the very least, the volume load is more important than any hormonal effects that are given.
Which makes sense. I mean, but what, and we talked about this a little bit with Stuart, is that, as you mentioned, the hormonal effects, at least, endogenous and hormonal effects you're getting from resistance training, not taking exogenous hormones, right, don't seem to have much of an effect on muscle protein synthesis. But, and Stu was mentioning this with growth hormone, affecting collagen synthesis. And so then a question I, of course, had was, well, what if that's doing something for preventing injury because you're getting more collagen synthesis in the tendons? And I mean, I don't know that anyone's looked at that, but
no, we don't know. But I would say, again, growth hormone is a very interesting hormone because it's pulsatile. So it's secreted at at night is when you're getting your greatest growth hormone release. It's your guess is as good as mine because, like you said, it's purely speculative. I would be skeptical that brief spike in growth hormone post-exercise would meaningfully alter tendon synthesis, let's say, to where it would be reducing your injury potential. But without knowing, it could. So
yeah,
I wouldn't dismiss it. We would need research on that.
With respect, and I think you kind of already answered this, but I just want to make sure, with designing this program, differences between men and women, should women then really be focusing more on the multi-joint exercises, specifically also because of the effects on the bone mineral density? I mean, is that, or should all of us be, I guess all of us should be focusing more on that?
Yeah, women really should not train much, if at all, different from men. The one area that there seems to be some evidence is that women are able to recover a little more quickly, both intersets, so they can actually rest somewhat shorter and gain back most of the volume load, like I said. It's not clear whether this has something to do endogenously, internally, or whether it's the fact they're just, in general, using lighter loads than men, so it's easier to come back if you're using 200 pounds versus 100. We don't know. And even the recovery between sessions may be a little better, their ability to recover. There's some evidence of that. But as far as the overall program, I don't program women much, if at all, differently than men.
For recovery, you hear a lot about the importance of recovery, what does that mean? What does that mean?
Well, it means that you need to take sufficient time so that you're able to come back strong for your. I mean, it means a lot of different things, different depending on the context. But I think in the context of our talk, that you're able to come back with sufficient energy and joint-related reserves where you're able to train effectively in your next session. That your training is not compromised in the next time you're going to lift. To some extent, it also has to do with the muscle protein synthetic response, which is roughly the time course is about 48 hours. Can be truncated a little as you get actually more advanced. You seem to get a higher spike, so it happens quicker and actually trails off a little more quickly in some of the research, which is, I think, getting a little too much into the weeds. But theoretically, you probably wouldn't need to train a muscle, or it would be beneficial to give it 48 hours rest so that you can maximize that and work on other things or even just recover, where it wouldn't be, it certainly doesn't seem to be beneficial to train it on a daily basis, the same muscle, and that having that recovery allows you to do other things that would potentially develop your body or your health to a greater extent.
Does it blunt hypertrophy if you're training the same muscle?
No, so there's actually some interesting, it's kind of equivocal. We actually carry, you can tell I've done a lot of work in all of these variables. So we carried out a study. These were young men. We don't have any evidence in older people, and I can make a case where it might, because recovery seems to be blunted in older, but I'll get to that in a minute. But in young men, we had them doing either the same exact routine done over 3 days with more. So when they did it over 3 days, they performed more sets per session. So it was like each session was twice as long, or else doing shorter sessions spread out over 6 days, the same exact routine. And no difference for most of the muscles, but we looked at the biceps, and the biceps growth was much greater in the group that did 3 days versus 6 days. Is that an anomaly? Again, we don't know. You'd need to replicate the study. Now, as I just mentioned, older individuals, recovery does start to become a factor. And this is just, look, aging, you can't, certainly you can stave off aging, but you can't prevent it and the consequences of it. So to a large extent, we can live extremely healthy and vibrant into our older years, provided we take care of our bodies and do things. But father time, mother time, will catch up to some extent. And we do have to take this into account with programming. So like I said, no differences between men and women per se, but there are differences between younger and older individuals. And one of them, when I have consulted with older individuals, is to factor in, not have as much volume, so that the ability to tolerate volume seems to go down to some extent. And by the way, interestingly, it seems their maintenance needs to be somewhat higher for volume. So they can't use as high volumes, but also they need to have a kind of a higher minimum volume to maintain their mass. There's limited evidence of that, but there was one study in particular that seemed to indicate that. And also having more cognizance of inter-session recovery, and sometimes having fewer sessions per week.
How much recovery would the older people?
So again, this really depends on the individual, because there's older individuals, like I mentioned, that I can wipe the floor with 30-year-olds. And there's other ones. So these are things that it really will depend upon. So it depends. How long have you been training? Are you just new when you're 60 years old to training, or have you been doing it since you were 20? Do you have joint-related issues? What's your nutritional status? What's your sleep and stress status? Are there any other medical issues? So a lot to unpack. And on a general level, I think most kind of 3 days a week is a default. That would be a good, I mentioned that 2 days a week, people can still make robust gains, but I think 3 days a week would get you a little better gains, and if possible, even on a minimalist basis, if you can do 3 half-hour sessions per week, I think that's a good kind of minimalist guideline for everyone, including older people. And then, some older individuals can do what's called a split body routine, where they could do, let's say, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and upper lower type routine, and recover well. whereas others need that 3-day, shouldn't do more than 3 days a week.
Is there anything that can speed up recovery? So recovery being passive recovery, active recovery, like things that could help speed it up nutrition-wise or other things as well?
Yeah. First of all, being recreationally active. So blood flow does help with recovery. One of the worst things you could do is just be a couch potato. So let's say you do a resistance training workout and the rest of the week you're just sitting on the couch, munching on bonbons and watching your favorite TV shows. Circulation itself is going to optimize the delivery of nutrients and expedite delivery and recovery in that respect. Other things have somewhat less evidence behind them. So massage has been shown to potentially help recovery. What's the problem with that? Well, it's hard to sham massages. So when your massage feels really good, and hey, I feel better, was that because of the massage or because of the psychological effect that I feel better now, I feel vibrant. Foam rolling, these are all things that it's hard to sham them properly and get a sense, was it really the treatment or was it the placebo effect? Because you always want a placebo. If you're comparing it against nothing, then hey, it felt good, so I feel I have better recovery. Taking in proper protein itself, that to me isn't a recovery strategy. That just should be part of your lifestyle if you want to maximize your results. But if you're not taking in enough protein are the building blocks of your muscle and of any tissues. So you're not going to get proper quote unquote recovery if you're not optimizing your protein nutritional intake. And there's other, essential fatty acids, particularly your N3s, your omega-3 fatty acids, seem to have certain beneficial effects on muscle development. Particularly, it seems for the older people, but we don't have great evidence longitudinally. We have some good acute studies that seem to show that. Anyway, so these are all, I think, strategies. Again, cost benefit. Well, massage, if you're paying for it, there's a cost to that. But if you have, let's say, a significant other that can massage you, could that help? Foam rolling, really not a cost to that. There is some evidence that cold water immersion, we can kind of get into this, might expedite quote unquote recovery so that you're not going to be as sore. So if the recovery has to do with getting back to trainability levels so that you're reducing soreness, and heat, by the way, is another thing, which generally does not seem to have negative effects at least. Again, those are potential strategies. Now, if you want to get into, it's kind of interesting with cold water immersion, cryotherapy, particularly it's been shown with the cold water immersion, there is emerging evidence that it actually has negative effects, particularly on hypertrophy, but on strength measures as well. Somewhat limited evidence, but it's been shown there's triangulation of evidence, meaning that we have acute data that shows it blunts intracellular anabolic signaling, that it blunts muscle protein synthesis, satellite cell. When you talk about anabolic signaling, the pro-inflammatory response, which on one end is why, quote unquote, it helps with recovery, but the acute pro-inflammatory response actually has been shown to have a positive effect on muscle development. So chronic inflammation, bad. Acute inflammation, good. At least that's the extent of what we see from the literature. And there's been longitudinal evidence showing that it blunts hypertrophy over longer term studies. Now that is when these studies have been done doing this every day or very frequently post-training. I would say that if you're only going to do it one time, let's say you're feeling really sore, nothing wrong with getting in a cold tub. Doesn't mean all your gains are going to go if you occasionally do a cold water immersion. But I do think that using it frequently, probably if your goal is optimizing muscle growth, not a good thing. Timing might be a concern. So if you want to do that, probably spacing it out at long periods after, but then you might not get the benefits you want. Like if you're sore, you're going to want to be doing it when you're sore. So if you're sore the following day, yeah, I think that might be beneficial, and where you've kind of gotten out of your window, or at least gotten the majority of your protein synthetic responses in. But again, the primary reasons that cold water immersion seems to have negative effects: number one, blunting of the pro-inflammatory response; number two, blunting of the circulatory response. That cold water restricts the circulation, and thus you're not getting nutrient delivery to the muscles. It's speculative, but that's the working theory.
Right, so that would make sense to not do cold water immersion right after your training. Like if it's like your day, like I like to do cold water immersion for brain benefits, like in, feeling you get norepinephrine release, and it affects my anxiety and my mood and focus and attention. But I don't ever do it after strength training. So it's usually on a day that I'm not strength training. So the other thing would be, you mentioned soreness and people using it for soreness, but what should you be sore? Like, should you train to be sore? Does that play a role in hypertrophy? And then, is that something, do you get more sore with age as well? Or what's that indicative of? I mean,
yeah, so another interesting question. Soreness, to some extent, is genetically influenced. And interestingly, women seem not to have as much soreness as men. There's been some speculation it might have to do hormonally with estrogen. Anyway, it could be other effects as well. But so it's an interesting question. Soreness generally is due to a novel response, or a novel stimuli. And usually it's primarily due to the eccentric component of exercise. And that, by the way, can also be done through, let's say, downhill running. It would be an eccentric form of aerobic training. But let's just focus on the resistance training aspect, where the lowering, so eccentric is a lowering, basically lengthening, muscles are lengthening under tension. And even concentric exercise can cause soreness, and there's muscle damage that occurs. But it seems to be also more specific to so muscle damage, and even damage within the epimysium or extracellular matrix. Again, these aren't necessarily clear, so it's connective tissue might be even more relevant. It's speculative that might have greater relevance to soreness, with nociceptors that are exposed to free nerve endings, and there's interaction with free radicals. So there's a whole theory behind this. Do you need to be sore to make gains? No. I think that's pretty clear. But could being sore potentially be indicative that there may be some additional positive gains? It's not clear, but a novel response, again, why does the body adapt? It adapts because it is being challenged beyond its present state. A novel response would generally indicate it's being taxed beyond its present state, and thus having some degree of soreness might indicate that you are challenging it beyond its present state. But again, some people, it's genetically influenced, so some people just don't get sore, and some people are very responsive to soreness regardless. There does seem to be a repeated bout effect, whereas you keep doing the same thing over and over again, the body adapts and gets less and less sore over time. But some people keep doing the same thing and they keep getting somewhat sore. Where soreness is an issue, so if you are mildly sore, I think it's probably not only okay, maybe it's positive, it certainly shouldn't be a negative. If you're not sore, I don't think you should worry about that per se. But on the opposite, if you are very sore, that is a negative, because that's going to impair your ability to train again hard. And that would be an issue.
Yeah, there are things people can do to help with the soreness that aren't going to blunt their hypertrophy, or maybe be bad for them health-wise. So are there that about any evidence-based things that people can do to improve their soreness?
Improve their response to soreness?
Yeah, so that they're not as sore as long, or...
Well, could you? Yeah, you can not focus on the eccentric component, which probably is not a great thing, because eccentric, not only is the eccentric component as important, there seems to be a synergism between eccentric and concentric exercise, where the intracellular signaling cascade for eccentric exercise is somewhat different than that of concentric, and that would imply a synergism in terms of the hypertrophic response. There is also evidence that muscles develop regionally. So there's interesting research that like certain parts of muscles will develop more than others. And eccentric exercise seems to work more in the distal portion of the muscle, whereas concentric seems to work more in the mid portion of the muscle, and thus combining them again would be beneficial. So it doesn't seem to be, although yes, you can reduce the soreness that's developed by not doing, focusing on your concentric. Wouldn't suggest that. By the way, I don't know if they're still around, but there was a gym chain called Curves. I don't know if you heard of them, but they had these machines that just did the concentric exercise, because the whole thing was they focused on older women, and they thought that this would be a negative, the soreness would scare them away. And they just had these machines that focused on the concentric portion. But again, if your goal is to optimize gains, that's not a great strategy. So look, you can do warm water baths seem to, again, help to alleviate soreness. Doing active recovery, just walking around, if it's for upper body, doing certain motions that would aerobic. You can pump your arms. You could do the elliptical that has the arm crank. Just to get blood flow to the area would help to alleviate the soreness. And the other thing I would say, if that's the goal, stick to the same exercises over and over. Now, again, one of the benefits, exercise selection is another potentially important thing if you want to optimize gains. And that's, again, promoting a novel response. Factoring in different movements can be beneficial to optimizing results. And that would, again, have to do with the novelty of the movement. But that will come with the caveat that there'll be some soreness.
Right. So two things that come to mind. One is aerobic exercise. You're talking about blood flow, and that's another area that I was wanting to talk to you about, was the combination of aerobic exercise and strength training and the effects on muscle hypertrophy. Combining them, maybe even just either with like days. So you do strength training one day and then aerobic exercise the other day. So that's kind of a little bit, it seems like what you're talking about, having the blood flow to help even with recovery or soreness. But also, what if you do it on the same day, in the same session even?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of talk about concurrent training being detrimental. There was something called the chronic interference hypothesis, which basically was actually shown in animal models and rodent models, where the signaling, intracellular signaling for cardiovascular exercise upregulated your catabolic pathways, your AMPK pathway. Again, I don't want to get too technical here, but the AMPK is a catabolic pathway which actually blunts the mTOR pathway, which is an anabolic pathway, and your alternatively your resistance, your anaerobic exercise was your anabolic pathway, and that thus if you did aerobic training, it would blunt the adaptations for resistance training. And that actually has been shown to be, at the very least, a way oversimplification. Now, at some point, there will seem to be some interference. But it does seem that that point is a lot further along than what we originally had thought. That, yeah, and I think that more has to do with the overtraining effects than probably the intracellular signaling effect, though it's not clear. But we have some pretty good meta-analytic data now showing that within decent volumes of training, there does not seem to be a blunting of the anabolic effect, and that's even when it's performed in the same day. There was some evidence that perhaps, even at somewhat higher levels, that maybe there was a negative effect on fiber type specific, particularly in the type 1 fibers. Again, I think it's a little premature to draw strong inferences on that. But what I would say is I think the general recommendations that I would make from the literature that we have, like you said, if possible, space it out so that if you're doing resistance training Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you want to do 6 days a week of training, do your aerobic training on your alternative days, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. If If not, possibly do a morning, afternoon type thing or evening, where you do, let's say, resistance training in the morning, cardio in your evening. And at worst, if you have to do them in the same session, always do the resistance training first, because if nothing else, the aerobic training can compromise your energy levels to do the strength training. It can compromise the performance. So that in itself would have a negative effect if you're going to compromise performance on your results. I do also want to point out that this is, again, a very nuanced topic. So how much resistance training are you doing? How much aerobic training? So it's particularly with the aerobic training, are you doing long, slow distance? Are you doing 6 days a week of marathon running training? Yeah, that's going to certainly start to have negative effects on your muscle development. If you're walking 10,000 steps a day, 12,000 steps a day, no, very unlikely that's going to have any negative effect. If you're doing 3 high-intensity interval training sessions per week, very unlikely that's going to have a negative effect. So there's a spectrum on these things. These are not yes or no questions that I can give a cookie cutter response, but on a general basis, you need to, I think at the very least, be in tune with your body. And that's, to me, one of the most important things I can communicate to the audience is to really start to be in tune with your body. If you feel you need extra time off, you're probably overdoing it. And I think a lot of times people are just oblivious. They get into a routine and it's just, I have to do this. And try to be intuitive. Use your intuition, and if you think you need a day off, take a day. If you think you need 2 days off. Deload periods, when done properly, can be beneficial, where you're having periods of reduced training frequency, particularly if you're training very hard. Now, if you're doing the typical type of workout that most Gen Pops do, you probably don't need a deload because you're not training hard enough to warrant that. But certainly if you're a very serious exerciser, bodybuilders, particularly in high-level athletes, interspersing regimented periods of reduced training frequency, volume, intensity, I think are very important.
How do people that are endurance athletes, like that are training for a race or whatever, do that? I mean, like, can they still incorporate their resistance training in their obviously very extensive endurance training program without overtraining? Is it even?
Yeah. So one thing I would say for endurance, training athletes are somewhat of encompass a fairly wide spectrum. But let's take your typical runner. So when we're talking endurance, cross country, doing marathon type running or long distance cross country, weight is an issue. So you want to train in a more minimalist fashion because higher volume programs will tend to put on muscle mass. You want to try, as an endurance-based athlete, to reduce muscle mass development and maximize strength development. And that would be using heavier loads. So that's where you don't want to do your light load training with higher volumes. You'd want to focus more on your, let's say, 3 to 5 rep training for a few sets. So that is not going to, the volume will be insufficient to substantially increase muscle mass. So volume is a driver of hypertrophy. And if you're doing low volume training with heavy loads, then generally speaking, you're not going to gain much weight in terms of muscle mass, but you will be able to get the benefits that will help you optimize your endurance capacity.
That makes sense. What about stretching? That's something, I see people stretching in the gym. They're stretching before a set. They're stretching in between sets, after working out. What role does stretching play in muscle protein synthesis or muscle hypertrophy or injury or anything, flexibility, anything?
Yeah, so different, I'll approach it from different levels, but on a basic level, most people think of stretching from a flexibility standpoint. Do people need to stretch? If you need more flexibility, then it would be beneficial to stretch. Stretching for the sake, gaining flexibility for the sake of gaining flexibility is misguided, because increased flexibility reduces the stability of the joint. So if you can do what you need to do from an activities of daily living standpoint, from a mobility and flexibility standpoint, no reason to gain more flexibility. If you are let's say a punter in football, you're going to need to be able to get your leg very high, or Rockette in the Radio City Music Hall. They would, necessarily want to do, if they're not able to do it, or even to continue doing it, to do some type of flexibility training. But for the majority of people, that's not an issue. So everyone has to assess their own flexibility needs. With that said, resistance training itself is a active form of flexibility training. And there's been studies that show that compared to static stretching, you get similar benefits doing resistance training protocols, provided that you're training through a full range of motion. So if you are lifting weights, total body, through a full range of motion, you get similar benefits to static stretching. Combining them is even better if you want to add on your flexibility. So if you don't think you've gotten enough flexibility from your resistance training and you need more from an ADL, activities of daily living standpoint, then go for it. Now, I've approached this also from a muscle protein synthesis. This is actually quite interesting. I'm collaborating with a group from Germany, and they actually have other research that's recently come out showing that long-term, if you stretch, now this is a lot of stretching, but they did an hour a day using the stretching boot. They got marked hypertrophy, like 15% growth in the calf muscles and the muscle thickness. Really interesting. Now, I don't know who wants to use a stretching boot for an hour a day, but it just shows that stretching, there is tension during the stretch, and that tension, muscle tension, is a mechanism of hypertrophy. So doing long duration stretching, and these were intense stretches that were like an 8 out of 10 on the discomfort scale. So not a fun thing. So it's not like, I'm stretching, and they were fairly intense stretch. So it does show that stretching itself can have an anabolic effect. We recently published a study, and there were some papers before this also showing this, that what's called interset stretch, loaded stretch, promoted somewhat greater gains. We used it in a calf exercise. So basically subjects did calf raises, what's called plantar flexion for their gastrocnemius and soleus, which are the two calf muscles. And this was actually within subject design, where one leg, they just rested for 2 minutes between the sets. They did their calf raise and then they rested 2 minutes. The other group, the other leg, they would do their set, and then immediately after the set, they would descend into a stretch, and with the weight still on. So they were, basically it was a loaded stretch, and it was intense. It was, they were kind of hurting at that last, were doing what they could to endure towards the end of the stretch. And they did it for 20 seconds, and then they rested for the rest of the rest interval. And we found somewhat greater growth in the soleus muscle, and really no substantial difference in the gastrocnemius. Now, interestingly, the soleus is a type 1 dominant fiber muscle. It's about 80% slow twitch type 1 fibers. So it kind of raises the possibility, is the stretching, at least the loaded stretching that we're doing, more specific to type 1 fibers than type 2? Not sure.
All this talk makes me think about yoga. And yoga, it's stretching, but it's also like pretty intense. You're holding the pose and your muscles start to hurt. Like, what are your thoughts on yoga? Does it somehow, do you think you could extrapolate a little bit?
Yeah. So now again, there are different. I'm not a yoga specialist, but I do know something about it. And there's different forms of yoga that some have more quote unquote strength related focuses within them. You certainly can gain muscle from yoga, but is it going to optimize muscle? No, because again, you're not really, as a general rule, at least from what I know through most of the forms of yoga, you're really not challenging over time. Maybe at the beginning when you're a newbie, you can, that's where you're going to see your gains. But over time, you don't challenge the muscle sufficiently to need to adapt. So you will plateau rather quickly. And you'll maintain. So you can get some gains at the beginning. Can there be ways that you might adapt yoga or alter the yoga principles to doing that? I would guess, but I'm not familiar enough with the strategy to to say.
So maybe yoga shouldn't be used instead of a resistance training, but in addition to.
That'd be correct.
Would
If
be
you
a
want to
nice-
optimize, again, resistance training is paramount. With all of these other things are potentially beneficial, and again, if you have all the time in the world, do them all. To the extent, I shouldn't say, as long as you're not overtraining, to the extent that you don't overtrain within your body's capabilities. But I think if you can only do one, my objective, somewhat biased, view is that resistance training is irreplaceable.
Yeah, there were some people that were kind of, mostly women wondering, oh, can yoga be considered resistance training? And I was thinking, I was like, oh, I don't know, that's a good question, because, I could, in my head, come up with a way where, yes, it would be. So that is good to know. One thing I want to talk to you about, I know we're getting close to the end, and this is something that I know you've talked about in your book before, and I've heard people talk about. In fact, I think Joe Rogan was the first guy that told me about this, and he talked about it, and I was like, you might just see my face on camera. I'm like, what? This blood flow restriction. Mm-hmm. What is it? Are there benefits, drawbacks to it? Like what?
Yeah, so again, another topic that I've carried out quite a few studies on. We talked about light load training. Blood flow restriction training uses a cuff, and it's used proximally in the muscle, meaning the upper portion of the muscle that you're looking to train. The caveat is, number one, you can only use it on your arms and legs. You can't train with really your chest, your back, or your shoulders, because you only can do it proximal. But let's take your biceps, for instance. You would cuff up by the deltoid. The deltoid muscle is your shoulder muscle. And you'd place a cuff here, and then you do, let's say, biceps curls. And you could do tricep press downs, the same thing. Would be the cuff in the same place. With the legs, you would cuff at the groin area, at the upper thigh, very upper region of the thigh, and do, let's say, leg extensions or squats. And generally you do this with very light loads. They've tried it with heavier loads, but it doesn't seem to work as well. That it's even very light loads, 20 to 30% 1 RM. But when you're using these very light loads, you fatigue much more quickly than if you just did the light load without the cuff. So let's say if you're using 30% 1 RM, your first set you might get 25 reps, and your second set you're down to 20, and then 15. And usually the rest intervals are rather short between them. Good evidence that it promotes similar muscle development to doing traditional resistance training, regardless of the rep range. Strength is similar to light load training without blood flow restriction. Your strength is not going to be, it's good for hypertrophy, but strength is somewhat compromised, which is always going to happen. Heavier loads are going to be better for strength. It's just the way it is. But you still will get, doesn't mean this is, again, has been taken, it's not binary, it's not strength, no strength. You just don't get quite as much strength, but you can substantially improve your strength as well, even in well-trained subjects. Now, the thing is it better than light load training? Well, light load training, I should have mentioned this, it is, and you've done it, you say, it's not fun for a lot of people, because you just get metabolic acidosis. Again, you have to train hard, and you get this burn, and when you're doing it over 30 repetitions, let's say, and it's a 3-second rep, that's a 90-second set. It's 70, 80, 90 seconds. There's a long period of time where you're experiencing that burn, quote unquote. Whereas if you're doing let's say a leg extension or a biceps curl with blood flow restriction, you're cutting the time. You're still using the lighter loads, meaning that you're not putting as much joint stress on, but you're cutting the time of that set, and thus somewhat reducing the discomfort. Is it necessarily better from a results standpoint than lighter load training? There's been no evidence that we've had, and certainly that I've seen on that. But there is some hypotheticals. I can make cases for certain, like the hypoxia-inducible factor is a substance that is thought to increase the hypertrophic response, intracellular hypertrophic response. So there are some logical rationales, but we don't have any longitudinal evidence showing it's better. And like I said, the limitation to it is the inability to do it. It's only specific to the extremities. There are some potential, I want to at least bring up the fact, in general, it's shown to be safe, but in people that have blood pressure issues, I'm not completely convinced there might not be potential issues. And the other thing that I want to point out too is that the research we have is in very controlled environments with researchers that know what they're doing. You get people, they just like put a cuff on and their arm starts turning purple, where you can really do some damage if you're not doing this properly. So you have to be cognizant of how to go about doing it if you're going to employ BFR.
I was going to ask you about that. Like, what kind of cuff are we talking about here? Like, when you're, because I always think of a tourniquet with blood pressure, where it's like.
Well, so in research settings, there are actually blood pressure type cuffs that are used that we can monitor the pressure that's going on. People just use like bandana ties and they use a rating scale, like a discomfort scale of 1 to 10, and saying you should be at a 6 or a 7. But a lot of times people don't gauge their 1 to 10 well, and they're saying they're at a 7 and their arm's turning purple. So you got to be careful.
Yeah. Well, this has been a really enlightening podcast for me. I really, really, really appreciate it. I'd love to ask you before we go
Sure.
about your personal routine. I mean, you're a busy guy. You're a professor. You're publishing a lot of scientific papers. You're an educator, and you're also like very spoken on social media. Talk about like how do you find time, and what does your routine, kind of generally speaking, look like?
Sure. So for me, exercise is like brushing your teeth. You have to do it. It's not really fun for me anymore because I train hard when I do train, and it's at least resistance training wise. But my routine is much more streamlined from what it used to be. Number one, just time factors. I'm not looking I was a former bodybuilder, and if I was bodybuilding, I'd be doing something much different than I'm doing now. And as I've gotten older, the recovery issues start to come in. So I'm on a 4-day-a-week resistance training routine. I do basically a 2 on, 1 off, 2 on. So 2 on, then I take a rest, and I train 2 additional days and take another couple of days off. I do an upper-lower split. My workouts last 45 minutes to an hour, so I'm training like 3.5, 4 hours a week. I train quite hard when I do train. All sets are within that like 1 to 2 reps of failure, and sometimes I do a set to all-out failure. And I do again, lower one day, upper the other. And I do look every day to get substantial steps. I focus on the step count. So I targeted 12,000 steps a day aerobic, when I say aerobic type training, just a general step count, which is for overall health. And again, my focus at this point is making sure that I'm maintaining my health. That's the most paramount to me. And, still looking good is an issue, but I'm not looking to step on stage at this point. And thus, again, it's goal specific and lifestyle specific. So I'm so busy, as you pointed out, with training, with research and teaching, and also travel, that getting the workouts in. When I travel, by the way, it's even now coming out here to San Diego, it's going to be tough to get. Maybe I'll get one day where I usually would get 2 of a workout, but it becomes more difficult when I'm away. And those are kind of structured deloads for me.
What about your protein intake? Are you the 1.6?
I'm at 1.6, yeah, maybe even a little more. I just make sure I don't micromanage it, but I make sure that I'm getting, I know just in general what I need to eat, and I say a little more is not going to hurt me, so I'm probably getting a little more than that.
Is it harder when you're traveling too? Or?
No, I was at breakfast this morning. I had my omelet and cheese, and I'll make sure I get that.
Awesome. Well, so Brad, you're all over social media. You've got 2 books. Can you mention the books? And then maybe, sure. So you're on Twitter. You're very active on Twitter, and you tweet very interesting studies. And I follow you on Twitter. You're also on Instagram. You're very active there. And your breakdown of the studies are great. So definitely want to make sure people follow you on your social media channels.
Thank you. Yeah, so my 2 books, I have a textbook, which is much more technical. For those who want to get into like the weeds of science, it's called The Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy. published by Human Kinetics. And that's a hardcover. That's a serious textbook. We use it at graduate level for exercise science students. But I mean, if you have a background, someone like yourself certainly would understand it. But I also have a consumer-friendly textbook on optimizing muscle mass called the Max Muscle Plan, and that's also Human Kinetics. Both of them can be found on Amazon. And yeah, you could follow me. Just Google me, and you will find me.
So you're at Brad Schoenfeld on Twitter.
Right.
And at Brad Schoenfeld, PhD on Instagram.
Correct.
I think I have that.
You got it.
Brad, pleasure. Thank you so much for
My
all the
pleasure.
great information.
Thank you for having me.